The manila envelope containing the house deed slipped from my fingers and scattered across my kitchen floor like fallen leaves. My coffee mug followed, shattering against the tile with a sound that seemed to echo through my entire life. I stared at the papers, my father's signature bold and decisive next to the realtor's contact information, and felt something cold settle deep in my stomach. This was my house. The house I'd been paying the mortgage on for 3 years, scraping together every dollar while living on ramen noodles and generic cereal. The house my parents had just listed for sale without telling me. My hands shook as I gathered the scattered documents, each page feeling heavier than the last. The listing price was reasonable, fair market value for my modest 3-bedroom home in suburbia. What wasn't reasonable was discovering that my own parents had forged my signature on the transfer documents, legally removing my name from the deeds 6 months ago. What wasn't fair was realizing they'd been planning this betrayal while I worked 60-hour weeks to keep up with not just my own bills but the crushing weight of my younger brother Daxon's gambling debts. The phone rang, jarring me from my paralysis. I recognized the number immediately, my father's cell phone. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. Maybe I needed to hear him explain. Maybe I was still naive enough to believe there was some reasonable explanation for what I'd just discovered. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk." My father Robert's voice carried that familiar tone of authority that had shaped my entire childhood. "Your mother and I are coming over." "About the house?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. "About Daxon's future," he corrected firmly. "This opportunity with the restaurant franchise could change everything for him. He just needs some startup capital, and the house equity is the perfect solution." The house equity. My house equity. The equity I'd built through years of sacrifice, living paycheck to paycheck to make mortgage payments while simultaneously covering Daxon's ever-increasing debts. The casino losses that started small and snowballed into something overwhelming. The credit card bills racked up at poker games and sports betting sites. The personal loans from loan sharks who didn't accept excuses or payment plans. "Dad, this is my house. I've been paying the mortgage for 3 years. And we've been helping with Daxon's situation for 2 years, he replied without missing a beat. "The family sticks together, Sarah. That's what we do. Daxon's learned his lesson, and now he's ready to build something positive. This restaurant franchise is exactly what he needs to turn his life around." I closed my eyes, remembering the last time Daxon was going to turn his life around. The community college enrollment that lasted exactly 3 weeks before he dropped out to focus on what he called his investment strategies. The job at the auto parts store that ended when the cash register came up short too many times. The promises, always the promises, delivered with that charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble since we were children. "What if I say no?" I asked quietly. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When my father finally spoke, his voice had hardened in a way that transported me back to childhood. Back to that familiar feeling of being the responsible one. The one who had to sacrifice for family harmony. "Sarah, don't be selfish about this. Daxon is your brother. Family takes care of family. Selfish." The word hit me like a physical blow. I looked around my modest kitchen, at the second-hand appliances and the single worn chair at my small table. I thought about the clothes in my closet, most of them purchased from thrift stores or clearance racks because every spare dollar went toward keeping my brother out of legal trouble. I thought about the social life I'd given up, the relationships that had withered because I was always too stressed, too broke, too exhausted from working overtime to meet my family's financial demands. "I'll think about it," I lied, because I wasn't ready for the conversation that was coming. "Don't think too long," Dad replied. "We've already put the house on the market. The realtor thinks it'll move quickly in this market." The line went dead, leaving me alone with the broken mug and scattered papers and the dawning realization that my family had decided my future without consulting me. They'd forged documents, committed fraud, and justified it all with the magic words that had controlled my entire adult life: "Family takes care of family." I spent the next hour on my laptop, researching real estate fraud and deed transfers, trying to understand how my parents had managed to remove my name from property I'd been paying for. The process was surprisingly simple when you had access to someone's personal information and a willingness to commit forgery. A few notarized documents claiming I'd requested the transfer, some backdated paperwork, and suddenly my house belonged to them. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Sarah Jennings. "Coffee tonight? You sound stressed in your last message. I hadn't realized how much my anxiety had been bleeding through in our recent conversations, but Sarah had always been perceptive about these things. We'd known each other since college, weathered each other's relationship disasters and career changes, and somehow she'd remained patient through 2 years of my increasing isolation as Daxon's problems consumed more and more of my time and energy. I texted back, "Yes, desperately need to talk." The coffee shop was nearly empty at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, just the way I preferred it. Sarah was already seated in our usual corner booth, her auburn hair catching the warm light from the vintage Edison bulbs overhead. She looked up from her laptop as I approached, and I saw her expression shift from casual greeting to genuine concern. "That you look terrible," she said without preamble, which was one of the things I loved about Sarah, no superficial pleasantries when something was clearly wrong. "My parents are selling my house," I said, sliding into the booth across from her, without telling me. "They forged my signature and transferred the deed." Sarah's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. "What do you mean they're selling your house? Your name is on the mortgage. Not on the deed anymore, apparently." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I'd taken of the documents. "They need money for Daxon's latest business venture. A restaurant franchise this time." Sarah studied the images, her expression growing darker with each swipe. As a paralegal, she understood legal documents better than I did, and I could see her professional instincts kicking in. "Sarah, this is fraud. Straight-up identity theft and property fraud. You could press charges." "Against my own parents? Against people who stole your house?" she corrected firmly. "The fact that they're related to you doesn't make it legal." I stared down at my untouched latte, watching the foam art dissolve into meaningless swirls. The idea of calling the police on my parents felt impossible, a betrayal of everything I'd been taught about family loyalty and obligation. But so did losing the only security I'd managed to build in my adult life. "How did it get this bad?" I asked, more to myself than to Sarah. "It got this bad because you've been enabling it to get this bad," Sarah said gently. "For 2 years, you've been paying off Daxon's gambling debts, covering his rent when he couldn't work, giving him grocery money while you ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. You've been working yourself into the ground to keep him from facing the consequences of his choices." The truth of it settled over me like a heavy blanket. I remembered the first time Dad had called about Daxon's gambling problem, how reasonable it had seemed to help out with a few $1,000s. Just temporarily, just until Daxon could get back on his feet. I remembered the promises Daxon had made, the gratitude in his voice, the way he'd hugged me and sworn this would never happen again. That was $47,000 ago. "I need to see the original mortgage documents," Sarah continued. "And any communication you have about the house payments, insurance, property taxes. We need to establish your ownership claim." "What's the point? They're my parents. Even if I can prove fraud, do I really want to send them to jail?" Sarah reached across the table and grabbed my hand, her grip firm and warm. "Sarah, listen to me. This isn't about sending anyone to jail. This is about protecting yourself from people who have decided that your financial security is less important than their son's comfort. They made that choice, not you." I drove home that night with Sarah's words echoing in my mind, but it wasn't until I walked into my quiet house and saw the realtor's lockbox already installed on my front door that the full weight of the situation hit me. My parents hadn't just put my house on the market, they'd changed the locks. I was locked out of my own home. My key turned uselessly in the new deadbolt, and I found myself sitting on my own front porch like a stranger, calling the realtor's emergency line to get access to the house I'd been paying for. The agent, a pleasant woman named Jennifer who seemed genuinely confused by my situation, met me 20 minutes later with an apologetic smile and a manila folder full of listing paperwork. "I'm so sorry about the confusion with the keys," Jennifer said as she opened the lockbox. "Your parents mentioned you'd been living here temporarily while getting back on your feet, and they wanted to make sure the house was secure during showings." Temporarily, getting back on my feet. I nodded and smiled and pretended this made sense while inside. Something fundamental was shifting. My parents had told this stranger that I was a charity case living in their house, rather than their daughter who'd been carrying the mortgage for 3 years. They'd constructed an entire narrative that positioned them as generous parents and me as the dependent child, when the reality was exactly the opposite. Inside, I found that they'd already begun staging the house for sale. My personal photos had been removed and replaced with generic artwork. My books and DVDs were packed in boxes labeled Sarah's Things and stacked in the garage. They'd rearranged my furniture, painted over the accent wall I'd spent a weekend perfecting, and somehow made my own home feel foreign and unwelcoming. Spike, they knew what's the suts. Ferrets are prawning. Savannah.
Right on the boat.
What? Victoria Crane. I spent that night in my own bed, surrounded by boxes of my possessions, trying to process the scope of what was happening. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from my mother, Linda, asking why I wasn't being more supportive of this opportunity for Daxon.
Each text was carefully crafted to make me feel guilty for questioning their decision, full of phrases like family first and thinking of the bigger picture, and sometimes we have to sacrifice for the people we love. The irony was suffocating. I had been sacrificing for the people I loved for 2 years, working extra shifts and skipping meals and giving up every small pleasure to keep Daxon out of serious legal trouble. But apparently, my sacrifices were expected and invisible, while his potential future success was worth stealing my home to achieve. I called in sick to work the next morning and spent the day at the public library, researching property law and deed fraud. What I learned was both encouraging and terrifying. Yes, what my parents had done was clearly illegal. Yes, I had grounds to challenge the sale and reclaim my property. But the legal process would be expensive, time-consuming and public. It would mean accusing my parents of felony fraud, testifying against them in court, and probably destroying what remained of our family relationships. More importantly, it would mean acknowledging that the people who were supposed to protect me had instead chosen to rob me. My phone rang while I was reading about identity theft statutes. Daxon's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered declining the call. But curiosity won out, and I found myself wondering what he would say now that their plan was in motion.
Hey, Sarah. His voice was bright and cheerful, completely unburdened by guilt or concern. Dad told me you're being weird about the house thing. I wanted to talk to you before you do something dramatic.
Dramatic? I repeated. You mean like calling the police about property fraud?
Come on, don't be like that. You know this restaurant franchise is going to be amazing for all of us. Once I get it off the ground, I'll be able to pay you back everything I owe you, plus interest.
Everything he owed me. For 2 years we'd never explicitly discussed the total amount, as if keeping it vague made it seem smaller. But I'd been keeping track, recording every payment and transfer in a spreadsheet that now contained $47,000 in debts that had never been acknowledged as loans. What happens if the restaurant fails? I asked. It won't fail. I've done my research this time, Sarah. This isn't like the other stuff. This is a proven business model with corporate support and established customer demand. The other stuff. The day trading that lost $8,000 in 3 weeks. The cryptocurrency investment that turned out to be a Ponzi scheme. The partnership with his friend Marcus that ended when Marcus disappeared with their inventory and left Daxon holding the debt. And if it does fail? The pause was long enough to tell me he hadn't considered this possibility, or at least hadn't planned for it. It won't, he repeated with less conviction. Besides, you don't need that big house just for yourself. You could get a nice apartment somewhere, maybe closer to work. Think about it like downsizing. Downsizing. From the home I'd worked years to afford to an apartment that would cost me the same in monthly rent without building any equity. From property ownership to another decade of enriching landlords while struggling to save for another down payment. From financial security to starting over at 31 with nothing to show for years of sacrifice. What if I say no? I asked, echoing my question to Dad from the day before. You won't say no, Daxon replied with complete confidence. You're not that kind of person, Sarah. You're the responsible one, remember? The one who takes care of the family. The one who takes care of the family. I ended the call and sat in the library's silence, surrounded by legal texts and public computers and the quiet desperation of people trying to solve problems they never should have had. Daxon was right about one thing. I wasn't the kind of person who said no to family. I'd been raised to put others first. To sacrifice my own needs for the greater good. To find my worth in how much I could give rather than what I deserved to receive. But maybe it was time to become a different kind of person. That evening I called Sarah and asked her to recommend a lawyer who specialized in property fraud. I also called Michael Adams, the financial advisor I'd been working with, to understand my mortgage options, and asked if he could meet with me about a more complex situation. Michael had been patient and thorough during our previous meetings, explaining concepts without talking down to me, and I trusted his discretion. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown and I spread the documents across our table like evidence in a criminal case. Michael studied the papers with the same focused attention Sarah had shown, but his reaction was more controlled, more professional. "This is definitely fraud," he said finally. "But the good news is that fraudulent transfers can be reversed, especially when you have clear documentation of your ownership interest. What's the bad news? The bad news is that stopping this will require legal action, and legal action means your family will know you're fighting back. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Daxon's confident assumption that I would never say no, about my parents' casual dismissal of my ownership rights, about the realtor who'd been told I was a temporary resident in my own home. "I'm getting there," I said. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the kind of careful attention that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in months. "Can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. "How much have you given your family over the past 2 years?" I pulled out my phone and opened the spreadsheet I'd been maintaining. $47,312.
And how much have they given you?
The question caught me off guard. In 2 years of financial crisis and family emergencies, I'd never asked my parents for money, never expected them to cover my expenses or bail me out of problems. The financial flow had been entirely one-directional. "Nothing," I said quietly. "So when they talk about family taking care of family, they mean you taking care of them?" The observation was gentle but devastating. I realized that in all our conversations about family obligation and loyalty, my needs had never been part of the equation. I was the designated caregiver, the one whose job was to sacrifice so that others could prosper. Over the next week I began documenting everything.
Every text message about money.
Every bank transfer, every conversation where my parents had made promises about Daxon's improvement or my eventual repayment.
I photographed the mortgage statements with my name as the borrower.
The insurance policies listing me as the property owner, the tax assessments addressed to me at my own house.
They served their own.
The evidence was overwhelming, but what struck me most was the pattern it revealed.
For 2 years I'd been treated as an ATM by my family.
Expected to provide unlimited financial support while being excluded from any decision-making about major expenditures.
When Daxon needed money for gambling losses, I was consulted immediately.
When my parents decided to sell my house to fund his business venture, I wasn't informed until after the paperwork was filed.
And we're there.
Sarah helped me organize everything into a timeline, and Michael connected me with Patricia Williams, a lawyer who specialized in family financial abuse cases.
Patricia was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and a directness that reminded me of Sarah.
And she listened to my story without interruption or judgment.
"It's in vermi teker ver.
"The legal case is straightforward," Patricia said when I finished. "Property fraud, identity theft, potentially elder abuse depending on how the documents were notarized."
What's not straightforward is the family dynamics.
"Are you prepared for them to escalate this situation when you challenge them?"
Woman.
"What do you mean, escalate?" "People who are willing to commit fraud to get what they want don't usually respond well to being thwarted. They may increase the pressure, try to turn other family members against you, or attempt to damage your reputation or relationships. Are you financially and emotionally prepared for that possibility?" I thought about my quiet life, my stable job, my small circle of close friends. I'd worked hard to build a reputation as someone reliable and trustworthy, both professionally and personally. The idea of my parents actively trying to destroy that felt almost absurd, but then again, so had the idea of them stealing my house. "I need to protect myself," I said finally. "Yes, you do, and that means being strategic about how we approach this. We're going to file an injunction to stop the sale immediately, but we're also going to prepare for the possibility that they'll try to retaliate." The injunction was filed on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning, my phone was ringing constantly. My parents, my aunts and uncles, family friends who'd been told some version of the story where I was the unreasonable daughter trying to destroy Daxon's future. Each conversation was a variation on the same theme. How could I be so selfish? Didn't I understand that family comes first? Why was I willing to destroy relationships over money? The most painful call came from my grandmother Helen, my father's mother, who'd always been my champion in family disputes. Her voice shook with disappointment as she asked why I was lawyering up against my own parents. "Grandma, they stole my house," I said, hoping she would understand the gravity of the situation. "They're trying to help your brother," she corrected. "Daxon has made mistakes, but he's family, Sarah. You don't abandon family when they need help." "What about when family abandons you?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, and for a moment the line was quiet. "No one's abandoning anyone, sweetie. Your parents love you, they're just trying to do what's best for everyone." What's best for everyone? I realized that in my family's calculation, everyone didn't include me. I was the resource to be managed, not the person to be considered. The pressure continued to build throughout the week. My mother showed up at my workplace, ostensibly to take me to lunch but actually to stage a public conversation about my hurtful behavior toward the family. She spoke loudly enough for my colleagues to overhear, using phrases like suing her own parents and choosing money over family, while I sat frozen at my desk, acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations around me. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, called me into her office that afternoon with a concerned expression and a human resources representative present. "Sarah, we need to talk about the personal situation that seems to be affecting your work environment," Janet began carefully. "We're concerned about some of the disruptions we've been experiencing." Disruptions? My mother's visit had lasted less than 10 minutes, but I could see how it would be described as disruptive, especially since she'd made sure to speak loudly enough for half the office to hear about lawsuits and family betrayal. "I apologize for my mother's visit," I said. "There's a family legal matter that she's upset about, but it won't happen again." "We hope not," the HR representative said. "But we've also received some phone calls that are concerning, people claiming to be family members, asking questions about your employment status and reliability." My stomach dropped. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about whether you're having financial problems, whether you've been missing work, whether you're mentally stable. We haven't disclosed any information, of course, but the calls themselves are problematic." I felt the room tilting around me as I realized what was happening. My family wasn't just trying to pressure me into dropping the legal case, they were actively trying to destroy my professional reputation. They were calling my workplace with vague allegations designed to make my employers question my stability and reliability. "I understand this is a difficult personal situation," Janet continued, "but we need to know that it's not going to continue affecting the workplace. Some of your colleagues have expressed concerns about the drama, and we've had clients asking questions after overhearing some of the phone calls." Kadar. Concerns. Client questions. I could see my career dissolving before my eyes, years of building professional relationships and establishing credibility evaporating because my family had decided to wage war against me for refusing to let them steal my house. "I'm consulting with a lawyer about stopping the harassment," I said, hoping my voice sounded more confident than I felt. "Right. Good," Janet said. "But in the meantime, we're going to need you to take some personal leave while you resolve this situation." "Paid leave," she added quickly, "but we can't have ongoing disruptions while you're working through your family issues." I cleaned out my desk that afternoon, packing up the photos and personal items that had made my cubicle feel like a small sanctuary. My colleagues offered sympathetic smiles and vague promises to stay in touch, but I could see the relief in their faces. Whatever was happening in my personal life, they were glad it wouldn't be happening in their workplace anymore. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with Sarah and Michael, trying to process the scope of what was happening. In less than a week, my family had managed to damage my professional reputation, involve my extended family in their campaign against me, and create enough chaos in my life to force me into unpaid leave from work. "They're escalating exactly the way Patricia predicted," Sarah said grimly. "This is psychological warfare, Sarah. They're trying to make the cost of fighting back so high that you'll give up." Michael was studying his laptop, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "I've been researching harassment and defamation law," he said. "What they're doing could constitute a pattern of harassment, especially the phone calls to your employer. Patricia might be able to get a restraining order." A restraining order against my parents, I said, letting the words hang in the air. 2 weeks ago, my biggest worry had been making my mortgage payment on time. Now I was considering legal action to prevent my own family from destroying my life. The alternative is letting them succeed, Sarah pointed out. They're betting that you care more about family harmony than your own well-being. Are they right? I thought about that question for a long time, sitting in my kitchen while my friends waited patiently for an answer. I thought about the 31 years I'd spent being the good daughter, the responsible sister, the family member who could always be counted on to put others first. I thought about the $47,000 I'd paid to keep Daxon out of trouble, money that had come from sacrificing my own comfort and security. I thought about the house I'd worked years to afford, now sitting empty with a realtor's lockbox while strangers toured my home and imagined their own lives within its walls. Most of all, I thought about the person I'd become over the past 2 years, anxious, financially stressed, isolated, and somehow convinced that my worth was measured by how much I could give rather than what I deserved to receive. No, I said finally, they're not right. The next morning I called Patricia and asked her to file for a restraining order. I also called my bank and credit card companies to put fraud alerts on all my accounts, and I changed my phone number to stop the constant barrage of guilt-inducing messages from relatives who'd been enlisted in my family's campaign. Most importantly, I called my supervisor and asked if I could meet with her and HR to provide documentation of the harassment I was experiencing. I brought copies of the phone logs Patricia had obtained, showing the pattern of calls to my workplace, as well as witness statements from colleagues who'd overheard my mother's public confrontation.
Janet listened with growing concern as I explained the situation, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the timeline and the legal case.
When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," she said finally. "We should have recognized that you were being harassed, rather than treating this as a personal drama you were bringing to work. This kind of systematic harassment is something we take very seriously. Does this mean I can come back to work? It means we're going to support you through this situation, and we're going to document everything in case we need to involve law enforcement. No one should have their workplace targeted as part of a family dispute." The restraining order was granted 2 days later, prohibiting my parents from contacting me directly, coming to my workplace, or interfering with my employment. It felt surreal to sit in a courtroom while a judge read the legal language that was supposed to protect me from the people who'd raised me, but it also felt necessary. Daxon violated the order that same evening, showing up at my house with what he clearly thought was a reasonable compromise. "This whole thing has gotten way out of hand," he said, leaning against my doorframe with that familiar charming smile. "Look. I talked to the franchise people, and they'll accept a smaller down payment. We don't need to sell the whole house, maybe just a home equity loan or something." I stared at him through the screen door, amazed by his ability to frame grand theft as a minor family disagreement that had simply gotten blown out of proportion. "The restraining order includes you," I said quietly. "Come on, Sarah, it's me, we're family. Family. Family, the magic word that had controlled my entire adult life, that had justified every sacrifice and explained away every instance of being taken advantage of." But standing there looking at my brother, I realized that family was supposed to work both ways. Family was supposed to protect each other, support each other, consider each other's well-being when making major decisions. What I'd been living wasn't family, it was exploitation with a sentimental label attached. "If we were family, you wouldn't have stolen my house," I said, and closed the door. Daxon stood on my porch for another 10 minutes, alternately pleading and demanding, his voice rising as he realized I wasn't going to open the door. Eventually he gave up and left, but not before shouting loud enough for the neighbors to hear that I was destroying the family over money. I called the police to report the restraining order violation, and they arrived within 20 minutes to take my statement. The officer was professional and thorough, explaining that harassment cases like this often escalated before they resolved, and that I should document every violation and contact them immediately if my family continued to approach me. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment intensified in different ways. My extended family began a social media campaign posting vague messages about forgiveness and family loyalty that were clearly aimed at me. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me with concerned trolling questions about whether I was okay and had I considered counseling to work through my anger toward the family. My grandmother called my new number somehow, weeping about how I was breaking her heart by turning against everyone who loves me. My Aunt Rebecca, my mother's sister wrote me a long email about how disappointed my mother was and how this situation was affecting her health. The psychological pressure was constant and exhausting, but what struck me most was how coordinated it all felt. This wasn't spontaneous concern from family members, this was an organized campaign designed to wear down my resistance through emotional manipulation. Patricia documented everything for the court record, but she also connected me with Dr. Amanda Foster, a therapist who specialized in family systems and manipulation dynamics. Dr. Foster helped me understand that what I was experiencing had a name: family scapegoating, where one family member is designated as the problem and targeted for blame when they refuse to continue enabling dysfunctional behavior. Your family has assigned you the role of the responsible one, the giver, the person who sacrifices so others can benefit, Dr. Foster explained. When you stepped out of that role by protecting your own interests, you became the enemy because you disrupted their system. Will it ever stop? That depends on whether you continue to enforce your boundaries consistently. Manipulative families often escalate their behavior when their usual tactics stop working, but if you stay firm, they usually move on to easier targets. The idea of my family finding easier targets was both relieving and heartbreaking. I didn't want anyone else to go through what I was experiencing, but I also couldn't continue sacrificing my own well-being to prevent it. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the restraining order was issued. Michael called me on a Thursday evening with news that changed everything. "I've been monitoring the real estate listing for your house," he said, "and something interesting happened today. The listing was pulled from the market and ownership has been transferred back to you." I stared at my phone, certain I'd misheard. "What do you mean, transferred back?" "Your parents' lawyer contacted Patricia this afternoon and proposed a settlement. They're returning full ownership of the house to you, dropping all claims to the property, and agreeing to pay your legal fees." The relief was so overwhelming that I started crying before I fully processed what he'd said. After weeks of legal battles and family warfare, I was getting my house back. "What changed?" I asked when I could speak again. "Patricia thinks they finally talked to a lawyer who explained the potential criminal charges they were facing. Property fraud is a felony, and with the documentation you provided, the case against them was solid. They also may have realized that the harassment campaign was creating additional legal problems." That weekend, I walked through my house like a stranger returning home. My parents had removed their staging improvements and returned my personal belongings to their original places, but the space still felt somehow altered by everything that had happened. I sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee from my favorite mug, and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd been through. Sarah came over that evening with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine, and we sat on my couch sorting through the accumulated mail and messages from the past month. Most of it was family-related drama that no longer seemed important, but buried in the pile was a letter that made my blood run cold. It was from Daxon, postmarked 3 days earlier, written in his familiar handwriting but with a tone I'd never seen from him before. "Sarah," the letter began, "I hope you're happy with what you've accomplished. Mom is barely eating, Dad's talking about early retirement because of the legal stress, and Grandma Helen had to go to the emergency room with chest pains after all this drama. I hope getting your house back was worth destroying the family." The letter continued for 2 pages, detailing the various ways my legal action had supposedly harmed each family member, ending with a promise that he would find another way to get the money for the franchise, since family clearly doesn't matter to you anymore. I read the letter twice, waiting for the familiar guilt to settle in my chest, the automatic assumption that I was responsible for everyone else's emotional well-being, but instead, I felt something closer to clarity. "He's still doing it," I said to Sarah, handing her the letter. "Even now, he's trying to make me responsible for everyone else's choices and reactions." Sarah read quickly, her expression growing darker with each paragraph. "This is emotional manipulation, Sarah, classic guilt tripping designed to make you feel like the villain for protecting yourself. But what if he's right? What if I did hurt people by fighting back? What if you did?" Sarah set the letter aside and looked at me directly. "What if standing up for yourself caused some discomfort for people who were comfortable exploiting you? Is that a reason to go back to being exploited?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized it captured something fundamental about my entire family dynamic. I'd been trained to prioritize everyone else's comfort over my own well-being. to accept responsibility for managing other people's emotions, to measure my worth by how much I could sacrifice without complaint. No, I said firmly, it's not. Over the following months, I began rebuilding my life with intentional boundaries and a clearer understanding of my own worth. I returned to work with renewed focus and energy, no longer carrying the constant stress of managing Daxon's crises. I started paying down the credit card debt I'd accumulated while covering his expenses, and for the first time in years, I could see a path toward real financial stability. Most importantly, I began developing relationships based on mutual respect and reciprocity rather than my ability to solve other people's problems. Michael and I grew closer as friends and eventually something more, built on a foundation of genuine compatibility rather than crisis management. Sarah and I deepened our friendship in ways that weren't possible when I was constantly distracted by family drama. The family relationships remained strained but stable. My parents and I maintained minimal contact, limited to necessary communications about legal matters and major family events. Daxon continued his pattern of boom and bust schemes, but without my financial support, he was forced to face the actual consequences of his choices. According to family gossip that filtered back through various relatives, the restaurant franchise opportunity fell through when Daxon couldn't secure adequate funding, leading to another cycle of blame and excuse-making. But this time, the family had to find different solutions that didn't involve emptying my bank account. The most surprising development came 6 months after the legal settlement, when my grandmother Helen called my new number with what sounded like a genuine apology. "I've been thinking about everything that happened," she said, her voice smaller than I remembered. "Your Aunt Margaret helped me understand some things I didn't see clearly before." Aunt Margaret was my father's sister, a woman who'd always been somewhat outside the family drama but had apparently been watching the situation with growing concern. "What kinds of things?" I asked carefully. "About how much you'd been giving, and how little you'd been getting back. Margaret showed me how to use the computer to look up that property fraud business, and I realized how serious what your parents did really was." The conversation was awkward and incomplete, but it represented something I hadn't expected: the possibility that family relationships could evolve beyond their established patterns of dysfunction. Dr. Foster and I worked together for nearly a year, untangling the belief systems that had made me vulnerable to exploitation and developing healthier ways of relating to the people I cared about. The process was sometimes painful, forcing me to examine how I'd contributed to my own mistreatment by accepting unacceptable behavior, but it was also liberating. "The hardest part for people in your situation," Dr. Foster explained, "is learning to distinguish between being loving and being exploited. You can love your family without bankrupting yourself to enable their dysfunction." 2 years later, I received a wedding invitation that surprised me. Daxon was getting married to a woman named Jennifer Walsh, someone I'd never heard of but who was apparently willing to take on his financial chaos and grandiose schemes. The invitation was addressed to me alone, with a handwritten note asking if I would consider attending despite everything that happened. I RSVP'd no, but I sent a gift. A beautiful picture frame with a card that read, "Wishing you both happiness and the wisdom to build your life on solid foundations. Family." It felt like the right balance of kindness and boundaries, acknowledging the relationship without pretending that everything was forgiven or forgotten. The most profound change was in how I understood the concept of family itself. I realized that the people who truly functioned as family in my life were the ones who supported my growth, celebrated my successes, and stood by me during difficult times without expecting me to diminish myself in return. Sarah, Michael, my colleagues who'd supported me during the harassment campaign, Dr. Foster, Patricia, and even some extended family members like Aunt Margaret. These were the people who comprised my actual support system. They were my chosen family, relationships built on mutual care and respect rather than obligation and guilt. On the 3rd anniversary of the house incident, I hosted a small dinner party for the people who'd helped me through that difficult period. We sat around my dining room table, the same table where I'd once spread out legal documents, and tried to understand how my own parents could steal from me, and I felt something I'd rarely experienced in my original family: genuine gratitude for the people in my life. I want to thank all of you," I said, raising my wine glass in a toast, "for helping me understand the difference between being used and being loved." The conversations that followed were warm and easy, full of laughter and genuine affection. No one asked me for money, criticized my choices, or made me responsible for managing their emotions. We simply enjoyed each other's company, celebrating small successes and offering support for ongoing challenges. Later that evening, as I cleaned up the dinner dishes, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years ago, I'd been trapped in a cycle of financial and emotional exploitation, convinced that my worth was measured by how much I could sacrifice for people who took my sacrifices for granted. Today, I owned my home free and clear, having used the money I once spent on Daxon's debts to accelerate my mortgage payments. I had genuine friendships based on mutual respect, a romantic relationship built on partnership rather than crisis management, and a clear sense of my own boundaries and worth. Most importantly, I'd learned that walking away from toxicity even when it wears the mask of family obligation wasn't selfish or cruel. It was an act of self-preservation that created space for healthier relationships to flourish. The phone rang as I was finishing the dishes, and I saw my mother's number on the display. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. "Hello, Mom. Sarah, honey, I hope you're doing well." Her voice was tentative, lacking the demanding tone that had characterized most of our recent conversations. "I wanted to let you know that Daxon and Jennifer are having some financial difficulties with their apartment, and we were wondering." "Mom, I'm going to stop you right there," I said gently but firmly. "I'm not going to be providing financial support to Daxon anymore. If he's having money problems, he and Jennifer will need to figure out their own solutions." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. "But he's your brother," she said finally, the familiar refrain that had controlled so much of my adult life. "Yes, he is, and I love him enough to let him face the consequences of his own choices instead of enabling his continued dependence on other people's money." "I don't understand how you can be so hard-hearted about family." "I'm not hard-hearted, Mom, I'm healthy, there's a difference." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and felt something I'd been working toward for 3 years. Peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the solid peace that comes from knowing you're living according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. The journey from financial exploitation to emotional freedom hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. I'd learned that the people who truly love you don't require you to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Real family, whether biological or chosen, lifts each other up rather than tearing each other down. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to treat you with basic respect, even when those people share your DNA. That night, I fell asleep in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by the peaceful quiet of a life built on authentic relationships and healthy boundaries. It was the sound of freedom, and it was beautiful.